Imagine this. A woman sits at the edge of her bed every night, staring into the silent dark, her back aching, not from physical labor, but from the invisible weight she carries. No one sees the weight, because it isn't made of bricks or burdens, but of roles, expectations, and a lifetime of self-abandonment disguised as strength. She is the daughter who listened, the sister who stepped aside, the lover who absorbed pain, the mother who gave without measure, the friend who remembered birthdays while forgetting her own. She carried the world, and somewhere along the way, she forgot herself. At first, it didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like love, responsibility, purpose. She said yes, willingly, repeatedly, to things that made others whole even as she slowly unraveled. Like a candle giving light while burning itself away, she was praised for her glow, never questioned about her flame. The world admired her strength, but strength, when demanded unceasingly, becomes a prison. There is a peculiar type of erosion that doesn't happen in a dramatic collapse but in the slow, silent grind of the everyday. She didn't wake up one morning and realize she was lost. It was more like looking in the mirror and finding a stranger's eyes staring back. And even then, she smiled because that's what was expected. But who was she when no one was looking? What did she dream of before her dreams were edited for acceptability, before her desires were filtered through guilt? What music stirred her soul when no one needed a lullaby or a playlist curated for dinner guests? Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But what happens when one never got the chance? When acceptance was not withheld but never even considered?" Her entire being was molded by mirrors held by others, and in every reflection, she adjusted her posture, changed her voice, folded her hunger. She became fluent in silence, in knowing when not to speak her truth. In rooms filled with laughter, she managed the invisible checklist, making sure everyone else was fed, happy, comfortable. She gave not just her time, but her essence. This wasn't martyrdom, it was conditioning. And yet, there was a part of her, tucked so deeply beneath the layers of obligation and persona, that whispered in moments of stillness. A flash of a forgotten joy, a memory of a time she said no and felt both terrified and alive. That voice was faint, almost childlike, but it was hers, uncorrupted, authentic. The tragedy is not that she lost herself. It's that the world applauded her for it. Her worth was tied not to her being, but her usefulness. And usefulness is a currency with a dangerously shifting value. What happens when the children grow up? When the partner no longer needs tending? When the job is gone, the phone stops ringing, and the house echoes with her own breath? She begins to notice the silence. And in that silence, an unsettling question. Who am I now? The mind doesn't collapse under a single question, but it can begin to fray. This existential fraying, this slow unraveling, is not always dramatic. It can be polite, clean, even suburban, but it is no less devastating. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once observed, "Mostly it is loss which teaches us about the worth of things." She is beginning to feel that loss, not of people or status, but of herself. She mourns things she cannot name, moments she never allowed, a self she never truly met. And so we begin, at the edge of that bed, with a woman whose story is not uncommon but rarely named. A woman not broken but buried, not lost but never fully found. She carried the world, and in doing so, forgot to carry herself. What follows is not a tale of victimhood. It is a reckoning, a confrontation, a search through the psychological ruins for what remains, what was never truly lost, only hidden. Shall we keep digging? Before something is lost, it must be built. Her disappearance didn't begin in adulthood. It was constructed, brick by invisible brick, in childhood, through quiet suggestions, subtle reprimands, and the shaping hands of culture and family. She wasn't told outright to disappear. She was rewarded when she did. When she dimmed her brilliance so others could shine, she was called humble. When she stayed silent to preserve peace, she was called wise. When she denied her wants for the comfort of others, she was praised as selfless. The world doesn't often acknowledge that the pedestal is just a polished cage. She learned early that her value was relational, never intrinsic. If she was good, she was lovable. If she helped, she was seen. If she smiled while bleeding, she was strong. She internalized the idea that love must be earned, and so she became the best performer in a play she never auditioned for. Perfection became her armor, even as it suffocated her. It's difficult to rebel against a prison you can't see. There are no bars when expectations become personality. The mask fuses with the face. The self becomes strategy. Every decision, what to wear, how to speak, when to feel, passes through an invisible filter. Will they approve? This filter isn't always imposed with cruelty. Sometimes it comes from love, well-meaning parents trying to protect her from a harsh world. Don't be too loud, they say, fearing her confidence will make her a target. Don't show them how smart you are, they caution, fearing she'll be isolated. And so she learns to shrink, not because she's weak, but because shrinking feels safer than being fully seen. Jean-Paul Sartre famously wrote, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." But what if the self she made was assembled under coercion? What if she never had the freedom to imagine other versions of her being? Is she still the maker, or merely the maid? By adolescence, she is fluent in the art of adaptation. She becomes who she needs to be in each room, each relationship. She senses moods like weather changes and adjusts accordingly. Her intuition, once meant to guide her, is redirected to manage the needs and emotions of others. Her selfhood atrophies, but her sensitivity flourishes, turned outward like a radar for validation. And then comes adulthood, where the stakes are higher but the script is the same. She becomes a nurturer in friendships, a fixer in romantic relationships, the reliable one at work. She is the one people come to, but rarely ask about. When her phone buzzes, it's often a need disguised as connection. "Can I talk to you?" is code for, "Can you carry this for me?" She obliges. She always does. Not because she's incapable of saying no, but because she fears what no might mean. Rejection, conflict, the unmasking of her unfiltered self. And somewhere, deep inside, she fears that who she really is might not be enough. Or worse, that it might be too much. There are moments, brief and almost imperceptible, when the real self claws toward the surface. A spontaneous laugh, an honest answer, a refusal. But these moments often pass quickly, swallowed by guilt, erased by apology. She apologizes so often it becomes a reflex. Sorry for speaking, sorry for needing, sorry for being. Every sorry another thread unraveling from the fabric of her identity. There's a chilling irony here. In becoming everything for everyone, she becomes nothing to herself. The philosopher Viktor Frankl, in the midst of unimaginable suffering, wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. But how does one change when one has no clear sense of who the self even is?" This isn't depression. It isn't anxiety. It's a dissociation that lives in the soul. A quiet erasure, one praised as maturity, responsibility, womanhood. And it leaves her standing at the threshold of her own life like a stranger, unsure of how she got here, or if she was ever here to begin with. She doesn't want to run. She wants to return. But return to what and who? Silence, when chosen, can be a sanctuary. But silence imposed, cultivated by years of suppression, disappointment, and self-neglect, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a vacuum. And in that vacuum, she begins to hear echoes. Faint at first, then sharper, more persistent. They are not memories, they are reminders of what she used to feel, of what she used to want. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, she begins to notice the hollowness beneath her efficiency. Her days are still full: meetings, messages, errands, logistics, but her presence within them is spectral. She floats through the calendar like a ghost, performing competence with mechanical grace. But inside, something is splintering. The fracture isn't visible to others. It never is. She is too good at performing wholeness. That's part of the trap. When your pain is invisible, your healing often becomes delayed or denied. She starts to dread the quiet, the moments when no one needs her. At first, she confuses this dread with boredom. But boredom is light. What she feels is heavier, like the weight of a question forming in the bones. What have I done with my life? Not the to-do lists, not the children she raised or the job she maintained or the people she soothed. Those are important, yes, but they are not her. They are what she did for others. She wonders if she has lived at all, or merely existed as a vessel for everyone else's lives. This is the beginning of the unraveling, and also the first flicker of rebirth. Because that question, painful as it is, means something sacred. She is awakening. Aldous Huxley once said, "Most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted." And indeed, she had taken her own presence for granted. She assumed she'd always be there, available, adaptable, dependable. She thought she could defer her own becoming until later. But now, later has come, and there is no self waiting at the finish line. Just echoes. She notices how long it's been since she made something with her hands. How she used to write poetry but stopped when it no longer served a purpose. How she used to dance. Not for performance, not for exercise, but just because the music told her to. She remembers the girl who stayed up at night reading by flashlight, because the world in books was the only one where her voice felt loud enough. And then the guilt sets in, because as soon as she touches these memories, her mind retaliates. How dare you grieve when you have so much? Others have suffered more. It is the gaslight of the conditioned self, the shame of longing, the fear of being ungrateful. But she isn't ungrateful. She's exhausted. And exhaustion is not cured by sleep. Not this kind. This is soul exhaustion. It's what happens when you speak everyone else's language for so long, you forget how to form a sentence in your own. So she begins to sit in the silence, not run from it. She allows the discomfort, the ache, the longing. It's terrifying at first, like facing a storm without shelter. But slowly it becomes tolerable, then revealing, then necessary. She starts asking herself questions that feel dangerous. What do I want? Who am I when I'm not needed? Do I even like the life I built? Or did I build it to be liked? The answers don't come quickly. Sometimes they don't come at all. But the asking, the courage to ask, is the start of reclamation. Because the silence, once feared, now speaks back. And it says, there is more. Not more to do, not more to give. More of you waiting to be remembered, waiting to be invited home. This isn't the end of her despair. It's the turning of the soil before the seed is planted. Despair, after all, is often the prelude to clarity. She begins slowly to reclaim her name, not the name the world called her, the one she whispered to herself when she was still free. It happens unexpectedly, maybe while brushing her teeth or standing in line at the grocery store. She catches a glimpse of herself, not just the image in the mirror, but something beneath it. A flicker of recognition and estrangement tangled into one disorienting moment. She stares longer than she ever has. There's a person looking back, a face lined with fatigue and quiet resilience, eyes that have watched too many things happen to other people. A woman who has given her whole life away in pieces, thinking the cost would never be tallied. But now the debt feels insurmountable. She wonders what it would take to start over, and whether it's already too late. It's not vanity that draws her to the mirror. It's desperation, a need to see herself, not as others do, but as she might have been if she'd made different choices, said no sooner, walked away faster, believed she had a right to her own life. This internal confrontation is brutal, because the truth is, she chose some of this. She said yes. She stayed. She played the role, not always because she had no choice, but because she believed love meant self-sacrifice. That worth was earned through erasure, that being good meant being gone. And now she must reckon with that illusion. There's a difference between blame and accountability. She's not interested in blaming herself, but accountability, that's where freedom begins. The hardest part isn't what others did to her. It's what she abandoned in herself. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But what if her why was always someone else's comfort, someone else's dreams? What happens when those whys are gone or no longer enough? She's beginning to realize that her why must change or she will wither. And so, she begins an inventory, not of possessions or titles or achievements, but of wounds. Where did she start to disappear? Who taught her that her voice was dangerous? What did she swallow in silence that still makes her sick today? She's not looking for revenge. She's looking for understanding. She recalls how her mother always put everyone else first, and how the world called it noble. How her father never asked how she felt, only how she performed. How every reward she ever received came after she suppressed something raw, something true. This realization is not liberating at first. It's crushing, because once you know, you can't unknow. She begins to see the patterns. How she attracted people who needed her to be small. How she stayed in jobs where her value was measured only in output. How she tolerated relationships that fed on her silence like oxygen. It wasn't that she didn't know what she wanted. It was that no one ever asked, and she forgot to ask herself. Now she's asking, and the answers are terrifying, because they mean change. They mean risk. They mean disappointing people who benefited from her compliance. They mean shedding the safety of invisibility and stepping into the raw vulnerability of visibility. She writes down, for the first time, the things she misses. Dancing alone, laughing until her stomach hurts, speaking without editing, creating something pointless but beautiful, feeling awe. She starts to wonder, what if life isn't about being useful? What if it's about being real? The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir once said, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." And now, she sees what that means not just in the societal sense but in the existential one. She was made into something, shaped, but she can unmake, reclaim, become something else, someone true. The mirror won't give her the answer. It never did. But it does offer an invitation to meet the woman behind the roles, to forgive the choices made in fear, to finally say, "I see you," and mean it. The hardest part of transformation isn't the insight, it's the resistance that follows. She begins to taste freedom, to speak her own name without flinching. But the moment she does, the ground shifts beneath her. Because change, even when longed for, terrifies the systems built on her submission. She says no for the first time in weeks, and someone calls her selfish. She cancels a plan to take a walk alone, and the guilt burns like a fever. She speaks her mind without softening the edges, and watches discomfort ripple across familiar faces. This is the cost of authenticity, losing the comfort of others to regain the truth of oneself. And yet, something deeper than comfort begins to stir, something holy. She realizes how addicted she had become to pleasing, to being liked, to disappearing in palatable ways. And now that she is attempting to emerge, the world recoils in subtle ways. Fewer texts, cooler tones, raised eyebrows. People who once loved her compliance are now confronted by her clarity, and clarity can be unsettling. She had once thought self-betrayal was love, that to give without limit was noble, that to set herself on fire to keep others warm was the right thing to do. But now she sees it for what it was, an unconscious bargain made in the currency of her spirit. She doesn't want to be rescued, she wants to be recognized. And recognition, true recognition, requires being seen in the fullness of one's mess, one's fire, one's unvarnished self. So she begins the work, not the external hustle, but the sacred inner labor of choosing herself over and over again, even when it doesn't feel natural. Especially when it doesn't feel natural, because natural has been distorted by conditioning, and recovery is, at first, awkward. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." And now she understands. This new freedom, this space where she no longer bends reflexively to others, feels dizzying, unstable. She craves the predictability of her old role, the control that came from self-sacrifice. But she knows she can't go back. Not now. Instead, she creates rituals, small ones at first, morning silence before the world demands her attention, writing one sentence of truth a day, saying no without explaining, eating what her body craves without shame, resting without apology. These are not indulgences. They are revolutions. She learns that healing is not linear. Some days she feels powerful, wild, divine. Other days she sinks into the old shame like it's a second skin. On those days, she wants to call someone to validate her, to tell her she's still good, still lovable. But instead, she turns inward and whispers, "I am here. I choose you." That voice, her own, is becoming the most reliable one she knows. People begin to notice. Some drift away quietly. Others try to pull her back into the mold she's shedding. But a few, a precious few, lean in closer. They don't need her to be small. They don't fear her fullness. They mirror her growth with their own. And this, too, is a gift of awakening. The refinement of relationships. She doesn't need many. She only needs the ones who can love her without demanding her disappearance. There are moments of grief, deep grief, for the years she lost, the joy she muted, the love she gave to those who never returned it. But even this grief feels different now. It's not hollow, it's alive. It reminds her that she's feeling again, fully, on her own terms, and that, more than anything, is the proof of transformation. Because to feel one's own life deeply is to reclaim it. Jeanette Winterson once wrote, "To be ourselves causes us to be exiled by many others, and yet to comply with what others want causes us to be exiled from ourselves." She chooses now to risk the outer exile for the inner return, to walk away from the altar of performance and into the wild terrain of presence. She is not becoming someone new. She is finally remembering who she was before the world told her to forget. She walks differently now, not in pace or posture, but in presence. There is a quiet steadiness in her steps, like someone who knows they're no longer looking for permission to exist. The world hasn't changed much. Its demands still arrive, its expectations still loom, but she has. And that changes everything. This isn't triumph in the cinematic sense. There is no spotlight, no audience applauding her awakening. In fact, most of the world doesn't even notice. But she does. And that is enough. She has become her own witness, her own sanctuary. Every reclaimed moment of solitude, of pleasure, of refusal is now sacred. She no longer flinches when asked what she wants. She takes up space without apology. She listens to her body without shame. She rests without needing to earn it. And perhaps most radically, she speaks when there's something real to say, and stays silent when there's not. Not to appease, not to disappear, but because now her voice belongs to her. And still she grieves, because every return requires mourning. She grieves the girl who believed she had to shrink to be loved, the woman who overfunctioned, overgave, overadapted to avoid abandonment. She grieves the time lost to being palatable, the relationships maintained through erasure, the dreams deferred so others could chase theirs. This grief is not a wound anymore. It's a well. From it she draws depth, compassion, boundaries, truth. She no longer sees herself as broken, nor as heroic, just whole in the imperfect, evolving way that wholeness actually works. She carries scars, but she also carries fire. And now, finally, she carries herself. Viktor Frankl said, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." She lives in that space now, no longer reactive, no longer defined by others' needs, moods, or projections. She chooses, not always perfectly, not always easily, but freely. That is the point. Freedom, she learns, is not a life without obligation. It is a life where the self is no longer the sacrifice. She still loves deeply, still gives, still shows up, but now from overflow, not depletion. She no longer performs to be loved. She reveals to be known. She does not twist herself to fit spaces that were never meant for her shape. She creates new spaces, or walks away. There are days she feels raw, not weak raw, alive, sensitive, in awe of the smallest things, the way sunlight filters through the curtains, the way her breath steadies when she tells the truth, the way her own laughter surprises her now, full-bodied and unsuppressed. This is not the woman she was 5 years ago, or even last year. This is the woman she was before the world told her who to be. The one who danced without watching, who dreamed without apology, who dared to want more. She is no longer carrying the world, because she has finally learned it was never hers to carry. She carries herself now with reverence, with presence, with a fierce, quiet joy. Not every day is radiant. Not every moment feels like a victory, but every breath is her own. Every decision is rooted in self-respect. And every time she forgets, because forgetting will still happen, she returns faster, because she knows the way home. Not the home built from expectations, but the one etched into her bones. The home that whispers, even in her most exhausted moments, "You are enough, even here, especially here." And in this return, there is no grand finale, only a steady, sacred unfolding. She carried the world once. Now, at last, she carries herself.